Well, good evening. And we're back here again. My name is Bob Greaves. They call me the Unconventional Pastor. And for those of you who've been watching, you probably have been able to figure out why. Tonight, I'm going to continue talking where we were in the last two shows, talking about some of these words and terms that people from time to time ask me about. And I'm hearing a weird echo coming back. I mean, hopefully that'll work its way out with the way Skype works, or sometimes doesn't. But anyway, we've talked about quite a few words in the last few shows. Some of these words that we looked at the word apostle, we looked at the word adiaphora, we looked at church, doctrine, repentance, sola scriptura. We talked about free will and determinism and the option of, freedom of choice. We talked about grace a bit. We talked about holiness. I don't know if we started to talk. Yeah, we did. We started to talk a little bit about the concept of immutability, just as we were leaving last time. And there's actually a little bit more that I wanted to say about that. And so I'm going to continue on from that point on. And tonight I'm hoping to talk about a couple of these extreme notions that come in, the omni notions that come into our theology. And so we'll want to talk about those as well. So let's get started by finishing up talking a little bit about immutability. Last week I talked about how some people have this theology where they believe that nothing about God can change. And of course there is a verse in the biblical text that says, I'm the Lord, I change not. And, to take that text and then in general just apply it to absolutely everything about God is, first of all, just in the standpoint of being a reader, absolutely an absurd idea. The fact that you ever do such a thing as that is just absolutely absurd. And it's not really honest. It's not honest reading. It's not honest thinking. It's not a good method of interpretation to just take that kind of idea and push it that sort of way. It just doesn't work. But people do. And now I think that there are ways in which God would definitely not change. There's ways in which we don't change. There's ways in which we do. And if we were talking, if the context in which we were discussing was one of those things that doesn't change about us, we could say the same thing. I don't change. We don't change. And that's just the nature of the language. So I find that this concept of immutability, where God is somehow frozen into this unchangeableness, is kind of strange. And of course, people find that it doesn't make sense to them to mix the idea that God could change with other risks. Well, if he could change, that means he could change his mind. Maybe he could decide to send us all to hell tomorrow. Yeah, I guess. I mean, that's absurd. As if God was so whimsical that if he wasn't somehow frozen in his condition and state, oh my God, look at how whimsical he might just end up being. Those extreme concerns are just, in my opinion, just part of the silliness of theology sometimes. But anyway, that's if you look at the biblical text, and I don't usually like to spend too much time with the biblical text, not because I don't find it helpful or useful, but I find it used in a bad way by fundamentalists and sometimes by evangelicals that I am hesitant to rely on the biblical text as a way of trying to solidify a point. I might make reference to it as to where does we get some of our ideas and what has been said and what it might mean. But I don't like the idea of appealing to it as a source of somehow final absolute authority. And we talked about that with the concept of sola scriptura. a couple of weeks, about a week ago. Anyway, there's another ability. There's another ability that's spoken of in a similar way. Not only is God spoken of as immutable, his immutability, but many times people will talk to me and discuss what I consider a concept of inability or of gracious ability. And this is the notion that many Christians would have, whereby what they mean by this is that we as people, we can't do anything in and of ourselves. Well, the only things we can do are those things that God has do, that God has.
Bob, this is your producer, Joey Livingston. It appears we've lost your audio. We're going to take a quick break, see if we can sort that out, and we will be right back. Matt, play us some music live with your own instruments.
And after that little bit of a glitch, we're back. I was getting a weird echo, which suddenly stopped, and evidently the audio did too. But we're back, and I don't know that we even know what happened, but hey, we're back. One of the things that happens with live shows, huh? We were talking about this notion of inability or of gracious ability. I find that that this is a way of trying to talk about life as if it really happens at some magical, mystical level instead of the practical level at which we actually experience it. Now, granted, I am certainly a person who would recognize that our attachment to reality is buffered through perception, and that possesses its own limits and its own constraints, but the actual reality is merely that actual reality that we are biologically windowing into through our sensory perception. But this notion of inability is in some ways, I think, a way of trying to get people to rely on God. I would say sometimes in ways they really shouldn't be relying on God. God is not here to be some sort of shortcut that we who are believers, we who are in the family, why we have this extra card up our sleeve, and we can play that card when we're in trouble, or when we have when there's things we need to do, or things we're called to do. I see that people who are well prepared tend to be more productive, no matter whether they're believers or not. And people who are hardworking are people who are very productive, whether they're believers or not. And this concept of inability is merely, in my opinion, a religious notion whereby we denigrate who and what we are as people. And where we try to lift God up by giving him all the glory, as it were. And I don't know why we need to do that. And certainly, if we are believers and we believe that God has created all that is, there is a sense in which none of this could really happen unless he created it. But That isn't to say that we are nothing, or that we don't exist, or that we don't play any role in what's going on. And none of that, but there's no reason to believe that people possess anything other than the genuine skills and abilities that are part of who and what they are as human beings. So this notion of inability, it says, is sometimes, I think, made too much of. And there are sometimes when even the biblical text talks about this concept, but I don't think it's talking about it in the same way that we as sometimes Christian believers talk about it. But that brings me to this concept of the omnis that I wanted to talk about. This is something that I think that a lot of people never really stop to think about. They talk about God as some infinite being. I think it was Anselm who even tried to state it something like this, where that concept greater than which you cannot conceive. This is who God is. He is, he is that being, a greater concept of which you cannot conceive of. And there's this need to kind of pigeonhole this inarticulated infinity, and then from that say, and this is God. Well, what an awesome and wonderful thing to say about God, I guess. It's very flattering. But it doesn't make sense. It really doesn't. I mean, it might make sense to people who don't understand infinity. But infinity, it doesn't work the way a lot of people think it does. It really doesn't. In infinity, first of all, even mathematically defined, is not the same thing as universal. And a lot of people don't realize this. In infinity, for example, in mathematics, we could talk in set logic if we wanted to. Such things as this. Let's pretend I have a two barrels in front of me. And in one barrel, for argument's sake, is an infinite number of dogs. And I got another barrel in front of me, two little barrels. I can hold them in my hand because, I'm God. Anyway, this other barrel is an infinite, one I got an infinite number of dogs, and in the other barrel I have an infinite number of cats. And let's say that each animal has a unique name. If I knew the name of every single dog, but didn't know the name of a single cat, my knowledge and my ignorance would both be infinite. Now, that is true in the logic of math and set logic, quite in spite of the fact that that might not make sense to you when you hear it, that a person's, or that it's possible in that kind of logical construct to think of knowledge as being both infinite and ignorance being infinite, and that both of these things simultaneously are true the whole while. This is possible when you're using set logic. So infinity does not work logically the way a lot of people would want it to. And when you start then trying to move from the word infinity to the word universal, now you start to turn everything into God so that it's more pantheistic. It stops working even as well with other kinds of supposed heresies and ideas notions that also don't work. So this when we're toying with this word infinity, and we're not intelligent enough human beings to understand the implications of infinity, we're merely talking in ways we think sound nice and very worshipful about God, and without any clue that we're speaking things that are nonsense. And then along comes somebody who does understand some of the problems of discussing such a concept as infinity, and they listen to us as Christians talk and they go, you guys are idiots. You don't know what you're saying. You have no clue what the implications here might be. And so I find that these omni concepts of God is omnipotent, God is omnipresent, God is omniscient. I find these to be concepts that don't mean what people think they mean and don't work logically the way they would like them to. And it also changes the way we think of God. It takes him into takes him out of some sort of relational element and context and puts him into some sort of box, be it you might think of it as an infinitely sized box, but it's nonetheless a conceptual box anyway. And think about it. When I look at the biblical text, the biblical culture wasn't trying to turn God into a concept either. Not that they didn't have their concepts, and not that we can think without concepts. But when it says, when the psalmist says, if I make my bed in hell, you are there. If I, no matter where I go, the point being here is this. The way that they thought about God and his presence was that he was everywhere or anywhere they could be. And that is a more personal way of talking about it. Then think about it. If God is omniscient, that would mean, he knows everything, then he would know everything about you. And why would he know everything about you? Well, because he's omniscient. How would he have learned what he knows about you? He's always known that. This presents problems with time, presents problems with freedom of choice, presents problem with determinisms, those kinds of thinking. But it's also radically impersonal. God would know everything about you simply by virtue of the fact, and I use the word virtue loosely, that he's omniscient. But this is not the same kind of God that Jesus spoke about when he talked about, the lilies of the field and the sparrows. A God who might know about every hair on your head knows about every hair on your head because he's paying attention. He's attentive. He cares enough to pay attention. His capacity is sufficient to take it all in. Whether or not we have to turn this into some sort of omniscient concept is crazy, and it gets into nonsense speak. Well, then someone asks me, how much does God know? I have no idea how to quantify that. But I do know this, that all the ways we talk about quantifying it are silly. And not only that, but I don't think that it even helps us to think of God's knowledge as some sort of quantity. I don't even know if knowledge even fits into that kind of a category in a meaningful way. And so I think it's important that if we're going to relate to God in a more personal manner, that we recognize that instead of thinking of as omniscient, thinking of him as more than able to pay attention to all the relevant elements of the universe and everything going on with me, and be very, very familiar with them because of his attentiveness and his skill and his ability. And whether we have to turn that into something infinite, I can see doing that as an expression, but when we try and turn that into an actual theology, I think it gets silly. Thinking of God as omnipresent, everywhere. He will never leave you or forsake you. He chooses to be nearby. The concept of the indwelling Christ, a real source of love, of encouragement, of real hope, is not something that you have to think of in terms of some involuntary characteristic of God or attribute, but rather the relational decisions and choice and constancy and faithfulness of someone well capable of making those choices and making them. So these omni concepts, even if they were true, and I'm saying they're silly, I'm not necessarily saying they're false. I'm not saying they're true either. I'm saying that it is a nonsensical way for us to be talking about God, and just how to deal with those issues is something that perhaps is really, in the end, too wonderful for us. But I think it only helps us to relate to a concept of God where he is bigger than our concepts, no doubt, because everyone, not just God, everybody's someone other than what you think of them as. And that would include God. But this notion of trying to put them into these little omni box is, in my opinion, nonsense in terms of logic and philosophy. And it's also extremely and radically impersonal. It turns God into something that is merely a theology instead of a personality, in a sense. And another word that I get asked, and I want to move on to next here, is the word justification. justification is a word that gets used, as far as I'm concerned, theologically, in a manner that is overly forensic. It's overly criminalistic, and it is turned into a form of judicial declaration, which, in my opinion, is a way of really saying that God is a liar, that God is dishonest, that God doesn't really deal with truth, that God justifies you, not because you really are just, but because he's declared it as such. In other words, God is playing games. That's basically what that teaching and that doctrine is really all about. God is playing games. He's not really being honest. And you want to know something? I think a lot of Christians know that. In fact, they're thankful that God isn't honest. They're thankful that God doesn't really see them for what they really are, but that God sees them as they're wearing their Jesus mask, and that there's this filter between them and God's eyes where he sees only Jesus, and it's some sort of a magical lens through which God looks at and sees something other than what it actually and in reality is. God lives in an illusion, is what this teaching is, the concept of justification. This is, in my opinion, utter nonsense. But it also leads, I believe, to the reason why I would say that I find a lot of Christians to be people who, in the rest of their lives, not just theology, they live in a lot of nonsense. They're dishonest. They're dishonest about their hypocrisy. They're dishonest about the way that they can come across. They're dishonest about their biases, their unloving attitude, their judgmentalness. Many times, many Christians, particularly the fundamentalist movement, they can be completely blind to. They not only believe they wear this Jesus mask so that God doesn't see them. They put this Jesus filter between them and all of their cohorts. Now, I remember the first time I became aware of the evil of this was with when I was a student at a very strong, hyper-conservative fundamentalist university. I began to see the university champion or put various other people in the national community up or down based upon how strongly they aligned themselves with the fundamentals of the faith. And this would be true without regard to how kind or unkind these people were, how loving or unloving. And some of the most harsh, difficult to get along with, people want to make you walk on eggshell kind of people, no matter how horrible some of these people were. If they championed the faith, they were good people. They were people we're aligned with. And some of the kindest people, some of the most loving people, if they didn't quite agree with all of these fundamentals of the faith, they're of the devil, they're of this. And there was this Jesus mask that they kind of put between them and other people. And so that they have no idea just how horrific the ethics and the morals are of some of the people they're associating with, only because, they're good guys. They're on the right side. They're on the right team. They have the right doctrine. What could be your problem with that? And seeing that was radical to me, particularly when sometimes these scandals would break out. And when they would, there was this need to keep it a tremendous secret. When Dave Hiles began having some of the serious problems that he was going through, I tell you, the amount of energy spent covering that up was amazing. And I didn't know Dave really well. I'd only met him briefly, and to know him and to see him and to watch the kind of things that he was doing, it amazed me that the Christian community, the fundamentalists, embraced him the way that they did. It just didn't make sense to me. And then later, when all of these stories finally come out, it's like, well, what'd you expect? Some of the things I don't really want to go through. You can Google it. Look up if you Google Babylon, Dave Hiles, you'll come across some interesting articles. And and just some very sad things. But this is where this Jesus mask justification kind of thinking leads you, can take you down this road of dishonesty that where, if God sees me through this Jesus mask, then I can actually afford to get away with a little more unrighteousness because God sees me in the righteousness of Christ, so I'm lucky. But what does justification really mean? I think that justification is a recognition by God that there is a sense in which all of us really want to do the best we can if we believe that could be done. We don't always believe it can be. We're not always encouraged. We've discovered how risky life can be, how many enemies one can have. We don't know what will work, what won't work. We don't want to bring on unnecessary suffering. We're afraid of that many times, and that makes a lot of sense. The truth is, we're all making good and bad decisions based on really attempting to find a way that will really work, that keeps me surviving, that meets the needs, and that in doing so, there is a sense in which, until we've really given up, there's a part of us that really wants there to be a very good reason for doing the things we do, and even some of the things we shouldn't do. We really did them for reasons we were talking ourselves into as being good. Now, I think that in a sense, this justification really has more to do with the sense that our redeemed potential, who it is we really can be, once encouraged. Once we can have a vision of the beauty of being human, once we can have a vision of the beauty of being loving and of being loved and the value of who and what we are, made in the image of God, that this sense of doing what we ought to do for really very good reasons begins to simply just emerge very naturally, so that we are becoming the kind of people who have every good reason for doing exactly what we've done. And we are becoming people who are getting so much better at it and growing and maturing in that love, that we are becoming the people who really do have absolutely every good reason for doing what we do. That's who we are. It's what we are. It's who we are becoming. And that's fully justified. That's what it is that we are. And that is our destiny. That's our future. That's where we're headed. When Dr. Jones even talks about let's move forward, that's where we're going. That's what we're moving forward towards. We're getting to that point where we have even better reasons for doing the loving things that we do because we understand it so much more clearly. And that's what I understand to be behind this notion of justification in terms of its legitimate sense. One more concept that's perhaps similar to justification, or at least related, I thought it was when I wrote it down, is the concept of mercy and justice. These are words I get asked about a lot. And I see mercy and justice as being a decision that is based upon the insight and the wisdom of the person who has some serious decisions to make. I really believe that mercy is a way of dealing with someone where, if they are in a position to truly learn from their mistakes, we might find it appropriate and useful and helpful to them, to us, to everyone, to forego certain of the logical and minimize some of the natural consequences of some of the things that they have done. That there might be a better future in investing in their recognition of what it is they have done, of how it is they need to change. And so that mercy isn't just letting somebody go. Mercy is recognizing that someone who has done something that isn't right to have been done has learned from the experience enough that there's actually more to be gained for them and us by allowing them to continue pursuing that direction rather than pursuing a direction of making sure that the natural and logical consequences of their previous behavior is what entirely befalls them. And so that mercy has a sense of looking to the future in making various decisions as to, how we will handle various different wrongdoings. Whereas justice is on the other hand, a person who has no appreciation for the things that they have done that they shouldn't have done. A person who has no appreciation for why that isn't good is a person who may need, for the best future for them and for everyone else, they may need to experience the force of the natural and logical consequences of their behavior, because it's not until they realize what their the outcome of the choices they have made that they can grow and learn. And so I see both mercy and justice as decisions made that are both redemptive. That justice has a way of helping a person to own the outcome of their choices by having them experience without mitigation the outcomes of the natural and logical outcomes of exactly what it is they've done. Whereas mercy is also recognizing that a person who is on a definitely positive learning curve, that it might be wise to, within a certain degree, minimize some of the natural and logical consequences they're up against, so as to give them a genuine fighting chance to get on the other side of that learning curve. And people who are in the habit of making very bad and wrong decisions do so for many, many, many reasons, and are dealing with many, many weights, burdens, and handicaps. And mercy can sometimes be an extremely redemptive experience. But mercy and justice is not a matter of, are you under the blood or not under the blood? If you're not under the blood, you get justice. If you're under the blood, you get mercy. No, I say, depending on where you are in the earth, it's almost as if people who think they deserve justice really can benefit from mercy. And people who think they deserve mercy are the people who probably need justice. It's kind of strange the way it works that way. But I see them as really executive decisions that can be made by a person who's responsible for overseeing some of the fine tuning of these natural and logical consequences to the behaviors of others. I mean, it's just in a small way, if I could talk about it in a practical way, with your own kids, with your own children. What if you had a child who throws a rock and breaks a neighbor's window? Well, does this child need mercy, or does this child need justice? And should we be merciful, or should we exact justice? I don't think that we have enough information yet in the scenarios I've given it to know. We want to talk to the child. We want to get a sense. Does this child realize you can't be going around breaking windows? Would it be helpful? Would it be a learning experience for this child to have to go to the neighbor, talk to the neighbor, make an apology, offer to do something to help pay for the window, do whatever the child needs to do to own their behavior? This is, in a sense, the justice that they need to do. They need to own this and deal with the consequences that redeem the situation, and make sure that the bad choices they have made are not something that the neighbor pays for, but that they pay for them if these are their choices and their decisions. However, if the justice required would destroy the child, whatever that might be, or if it is something where the child is discovering to help that child out, to say, well, I'll tell you what, you do this and you do that, and I'll help you earn the money, and in the meantime, I'll buy the glass and we'll get the window fixed, and work with the child in a merciful way that also allows the child to understand that they have to own their choices. That there's a sense here in which mercy and justice are weighed depending upon how fruitful and redemptive they would be in the life of the person who's evidently done something that isn't really going to work out well. And so mercy and justice are an attempt of people who are in a position of responsibility in caring for a person in development, or a person who's under their jurisdiction for whatever reason. These are tools intended to give some flexibility in dealing with the motive, intent, and learning curve and attitude of the wrongdoer. These are not some sort of just judicial, you're in this camp, you're in that camp. When we do it that way, neither mercy nor justice are at all personal. Neither of them are even meaningful. You're just lucky or not. And it's entirely arbitrary. It just doesn't make sense. And so I find that some of the traditional views of mercy and justice are philosophically illogical, and they don't make sense. They seek to really just justify a theology of death, a theology of violence, a theology of a violent atonement, a theology that, frankly, in my opinion, doesn't really work and doesn't even really lead to meaningfully changed lives. And this brings me to another thing I want to talk about tonight. I get asked about this word tulip. I was talking to Greg Bray about that a little earlier. The tulip, the TULIP of Calvinism. I've known some people who, some people say, well, I'm a 5-point Calvinist. And some people say, well, I'm a 4-point Calvinist. They might be 1 or 2 points that they drop. Some will drop the limited atonement thing, but they keep the other 4. I'm what you might call a pointless Calvinist. I don't know that I accept any of the points of Calvinism as being true. And that doesn't mean I have to run to the other side either. What's usually people saying, well, you're either a Calvinist or you're a Arminianist, and I don't see that those are the only options, and I certainly don't choose from among them. But anyhow, there's this very popular notion of Calvinism. And that didn't really begin with Calvin. In some ways, it really begins prior to Augustine, who simply brought many of these points to bear and were really held on very strongly during the Reformation by, in some ways, Luther, in some ways, Zwingli, Calvin, people like this. But anyhow, Calvin was the one whose institutes and whose teaching and whose efforts certainly made them more memorable, and he seemed to express them in a way that those people who would consider themselves believers in this kind of a theology so much appreciated that it's taken on his name of Calvinism. So tulip is the name of that flower, and it stands for this, the TULIP. T stands for this belief of total depravity. Now, it's amazing to me that this could even be in the concept of a Christian theology. For those of us who are to love our neighbor, for those of us who are supposed to love our enemies, to regard a theology that identifies yourself, your neighbor, and your enemy as somebody who in their absolute essence is totally depraved. I don't see how it's possible. What a challenge, for you to take that. Why is that not seen as a tremendous slander? What is it about total depravity that makes it so appealing? I certainly don't see it as being the expression of Scripture, and I realize that the Calvinists do. But what a thing to say about fellow human beings. What is possible for us to accomplish in life if we're to really believe that we are that depraved? And I'll tell you what, some of the most confident Calvinists that I know are not people who behave and act as if they consider themselves to be that totally depraved. They seem to come across in a manner where they have some sort of psychological or theological buffer that somehow makes that a thing they don't need to worry about or deal with, or that maybe that's where the Jesus mask comes in. But total depravity is, in my opinion, an aggressively violent and terrible thing to embrace, as it takes a look at your fellow man and puts him in the worst possible light. It's not a kind of way of hoping all things, believing all things. It isn't really an expression of love. It is an expression of hate, of denigration, of putting down. It's a form of actually psychological, sociologists or psychologists might call it leveling. Leveling is a is a social interaction between two people where one feels the need to put the other one down, put them in their place so that they can cope better by knowing that this person is really somehow beneath a certain level that that we don't want them to imagine they are at. And it's so this leveling is this theological leveling is, in my opinion, really nothing other than an extremely ill, psychologically ill coping mechanism projected upon God. Total depravity. Can't accept it at all. That's the T. The U is the the unconditional election. And this is some sort of a belief that that everybody who is to be saved has been determined to have been saved in eternity past, and that it's based on absolutely nothing. To believe, when you combine this with the concept that they could even have any insolence over the moral depravity that they seem to sometimes love to preach about, is kind of strange. It's basically is saying that the card game is over before it ever began, and it's just going to be this way, and that's tough. It's just the way that it is. It's an extremely hopeless, meritless, useless way of thinking, as far as I'm concerned. The unconditional election. The L stands for limited atonement, and in that, here, I don't even see where they get this out of Scripture. In fact, if anything, they get this out of instead of getting it from the biblical text, they get it from their own sense of logic, something they would say they don't really want to do, but particularly if they're saying sola scriptura. So this isn't really even a biblical notion of limited atonement in its except that they can find some verses that might bolster it. But the notion is this. Those who believe in limited atonement want to believe that when Jesus died on the cross, the blood that was shed, every single drop of it, was shed only for the people who will be saved. For a person who will not be saved, who will spend eternity in hell, there was not one drop of Jesus' blood that was shed for them. Well, this is part, of course, of that violent atonement concept, but it's a particularly us and them powerful rejection projected upon God of everybody who isn't going to end up agreeing with me and my religion. To me, it is such a nonsensical and ill way of looking at theology. I just don't understand it. Limited atonement. I mean, I don't understand how a person can believe in that and then look you in the face and think that they are saying that with a sense of honesty, care, love, integrity, or Christian spirit. It just strikes me as being very hostile to true Christian thinking. I don't see the person Jesus and the stories that we have about him. I don't see him walking around with that kind of an attitude that would be within a person who really believed that kind of a thing, such as limited atonement. That brings us to the I, which is irresistible grace. Here, that's a part of that notion of inability again, and of gracious ability. This is the notion that there's nothing you can do to actually end up believing in God. God will call you when he's damn well ready, and when he calls you, you will come. You're basically at the end of his string, and when he yanks on it, there you go. And there's a sense in which this concept also removes from all human beings any real responsibility while still holding them eternally responsible for everything. It is a catch-22 of the worst sort. It's a double bind of the worst sort. It is nothing other than a way of getting people under great duress so that they have to try to figure out how they're going to cope. And of course, the way they're going to cope and deal with it, we have a few comments here, is by being a part of your religion. A viewer comment, someone said there's different magnitudes of infinity, like sets of infinity that differ in size. that's true. When you're dealing with infinity, you're dealing with a mathematical concept that is, in some ways, defined in a way that is difficult to do the math with, and difficult to make comparisons. And it allows for, something that is 2 times infinity is twice as large as something that's 1 times is infinity, in a sense, and yet they're both infinite. How does that work? This is not necessarily something that makes easy sense to us, but when you're doing the math of infinity, it's there. Viewer comment. Could the behaviors be sociological in nature more so than theological for the university folks? I'm not sure what the question is in reference to. So I don't know if I can answer that question. The comment came out. Maybe sometime in the future, if we could give that back to a context, I can answer it a little bit better. A viewer comment, beautifully said for the concept of justification. Indeed, Bob. Well, thank you. Thank you. And then I have gotten the impression that the Calvinists may be a major force behind presuppositionalism. No doubt that it's going to be very appealing to them. Yes, I think it's true. Many people who are in the fundamentalist movement are really what you might call moderate Calvinists. Many of them will drop the limited atonement part. Many of them will also maybe not consider grace as entirely irresistible. We've only got a few more minutes here, and I'd like to see if I could wrap up this tulip, give you a whole flower. So let me move on from irresistible grace, this notion that God is the one pulling all these strings, and you really have no say and no real choice in the matter. To me, this also makes it all the more uproarious and outrageous that this is the God who has any right to put anybody in hell for all eternity when he's the one pulling all the strings. There's a sense in which I don't see how this kind of a theology can work without everything being God's fault. There's just no way to get around it, as far as I'm concerned, unless you want to be dishonest about it. So this notion of irresistible grace strikes me as I don't know. It's nonsense. It may make sense to some people because they think it sounds worshipful or holy or whatever, but I don't see it that way. And then, of course, the P is the perseverance of the saints. And this is the idea that once a person has begun the good work, once the work of redemption has started in them, it will complete. This is a person who will persevere. They will not quit. They won't walk away. They won't leave the faith. They won't, if they left the faith, they were never really part of it. Some of the concepts from the biblical text are taken out to try to maintain that. Now, there is a sense in which I do believe that it is God's intention to restore all things. And so I do see it as part of God's plan that he will persevere, that he will continue. He will do what he's going to do until all things are restored. And that includes not just, doing it to us so that we are involuntarily involved, but I think that there's a sense in which every human being, instead of looking at the perseverance of the saints, I would look at it this way: the winnability of human nature. The fact that every person is a person who can be touched by love. Every single person is someone in whose life love can make a difference, a real difference, can bring to them some genuine changes that would be well worth having, very redemptive kinds of changes. It's just a part of human nature. But I think that when we take a look at it and put it into terms of perseverance of the saints, we're actually really creating a structural, institutional concept of us and them and enforcing it, making sure that all the people who join us don't ever dare leave, lest it be proven to them through this perseverance issue that they really never were saved in the first place, which helps to maintain the manipulation. Well, anyhow, that's the end of the tulip, and I've gone a little bit over time, but that's it for now, and I will catch you again later. But I'm also going to be back with Dr. Jones in just a few minutes. We'll see you then.